And I totally agree with Wes in that we typically work as a team. There's often that we'll have a meeting that can be the attorney, the CPA, and the wealth advisor all there at the same time. And that is very efficient, I think, for the client. I know that sometimes they're like, oh no, billable rates all in the room at the same time. But it really reduces the time, I think, that people spend, because if we can all get together before we each kind of go off and do our own thing, it's usually more efficient for the three of us to sit down, talk about what strategy we're going to potentially, say we're talking about revising their estate plan, doing some tax planning, that you need to include both the attorney and the CPA sometimes. It's not every year does that happen, but with a big transaction happening, and depending on if you need to update your estate plan or something like that, it might make sense to have a meeting.
You guys hear okay?
Not too bad.
Yeah, a little louder.
Can you speak louder? Do you want the microphone?
Possibly, because I'm soft spoken. I don't want to.
And we're gonna put the other things
I'm always soft.
Testing.
That's good. You have to hold it pretty close.
I'm always guilty of having a soft voice.
Closer.
Of having a soft voice.
No.
Do I need to say something? Hello?
That's now it's good. Wow, that's pretty close.
As if like
Just like Prince.
Try it again.
Okay. Better?
Back row. In here. I can't tell it all. The other thing I should have probably started with was, I imagine many of you already have a CPA, and they know all about your business and what's already happened. Because many times, I'm the last person on the team, not the first person on the team. But that doesn't mean that 2 years from now, if we think we want to make an adjustment and some planning, that we wouldn't want to have a group meeting together. But I think it's important that the CPA is very familiar with various investments and the taxability things regarding that. And there's sometimes investments that are private, that you have to wait for K1s and different things like that. But in general, most CPAs are on top of all of those things. So hopefully your current advisor can continue in that role with the history that they already know. There are, I'd say as far as trying to have them be proactive, one way that we make it more easy for your CPAs is we every quarter send directly to everyone's CPA the tax information from our accounts. So when they need to do estimated tax payments, they already have the information. Some clients like to get it themselves too, so we just accommodate all that and try to simplify. And when the K1s come out in tax season, we also will deliver those direct to the CPAs. I don't know if there's any specific questions that people have about selecting a CPA that I haven't hit on, but well-rounded background.
Can we find them on Yelp? Check them on Yelp. I think it's kind of like in the veterinary profession. There are some great veterinarians in the community. There are some where it's like, scare you there's some in between. It's always just, I mean, you can go, you know, you can ask somebody, but if they're not familiar with the profession, it's really tough to.
And we often, if someone is new to us and doesn't have a CPA that they are confident in, we can clearly give 3 names of ones that we worked with for many years that we're confident in, and let them meet with them, interview them, see which one they feel comfortable with. Or maybe you'd ask a fellow veterinarian in your area. That's
And I did that, and, you know, a guy that I respect a lot, he turned me on to somebody, and I started using him, and used him for like 5 years, and I went back to my buddy, who, again, I respect a lot. I said, man, he's been having a lot of issues, it seems like, and he goes, oh yeah, I fired him, you know, 4 years ago. I said, did you call me? We'll bought you a beer for that one.
Yeah.
But are there any sites that you can, that are reputable, that you can?
I think credentials, obviously they've taken the CPA to qualify, but they're also required to keep up on their CPE credits, just like you all have to keep up on credits education-wise. So it's, I think it would be more about finding the right fit for you then, and talking to a few people, just to interview again.
One of the things that, when you and I were talking about, you had mentioned is there's a difference in what you call just a regular tax CPA and somebody that also did tax planning or projections or thought kind of in a bigger scheme.
Right, and I think it's only from experience of working with someone that you would know that for sure. But I think some CPAs are more proactive, and when they do your tax return, they're thinking about what could I be advising my client about, that I would do this differently, or they'll come back and let you know that next year let's take this, double up on this deduction in 1 year, and then the next year, you know, spread it, because they think you'll be able to benefit by getting more, you'll like exceed a limit or something, so you can benefit from that specific item. And the other thing is, we are involved, and with my tax background, many times I might even suggest to a client some strategies, and then have a meeting with them and their accountant. And another thing that I really do quite often is have a meeting including the accountant toward the end of the year, but still with enough time that we can make some changes if we want to. And at that meeting, before that meeting, we send them the information year to date that we have, and try to get them to run a projection so that they know where they stand. And that's helpful, because then we can make changes. So if you have a large capital gain, we can look in the portfolio and decide to sell some things that are losses to offset some of that gain. Those type of things is very helpful, usually in the fourth quarter when we get together and meet. Yes?
Are there any, and this might be a general question or a broad question, but are there any general red flags that you should look for if you have a CPA that may be not up to practicing understanding, even though they are certified?
I believe that you could probably go to the local CPA's office or society and ask if there's any complaints filed on anyone, whether it went to that extreme, if they did something wrong or not, would be of note. I can't think of any specific red flag. I think maybe it would be, if you have some concerns, I would invite your wealth advisor or your attorney to have a meeting with them, and they could probably help identify and maybe ask some more questions that would help you either feel more comfortable or less comfortable, and you can make a change.
We've, in the course of almost 40 years, we've had 4 5 accountants. The first 3 really impressed us. They were young, but they allowed their business to grow too much, and so they weren't giving us the service, or they would not be proactive. They would answer our questions but not lead us. And as veterinarians, we're expected to say, well, you may not have thought of this, but you should be doing this. And so some accountants don't think that way. So we sought out a person who was comfortable with the size of their business and was proactive in advice. And those 2 things, we've been with the same accountant now for 15 years. We've been very happy with those 2 elements.
I think that's a very good point, and the question to ask about that would be, how many clients do you have, and how many accountants in the office to service them? And try to think about what that ratio is to see if they have the capacity to do the planning side.
I was gonna sort of say a very simple thing, and I think the question is, what are you looking for out of the accountant? The group that we're with now talks to us about disability planning and estate planning, and I think somebody who looks at the whole picture like that wants to see all your investments. Not that they're handling all of them, but they want to see everything and see where you are. I think that's a really important thing to look for when you're choosing. Sort of ask them. It's not like they're not going to say, we'll sell you this life insurance policy to fund the death benefit taxes, but they would put you in contact with somebody who would give you information. At least they brought it up, or we wouldn't think of it ourselves.
That's a good point, and that makes me think of, there's an actual designation that a CPA can get it's PFS, and it's Personal Financial Specialist. So someone with that extra designation, or a master's in tax or things like that, would signify that they probably have deeper knowledge about the planning side. Any other questions? Okay. Just keep going.
Yeah.
So to start with, maybe just give you a little background. I am you already told some of my background, but I think it's important to know that I worked in wealth management for many years. Previous to that, I was at Arthur Andersen and at KPMG in the tax area for many years. Prior to that, it was almost 10 years that I worked in public accounting first. And then the other thing that I think some of the things that differentiate is that I worked on some really large situations in one of the largest foundations in Minnesota. I was the trustee role as well as a wealth advisor for that. And the experiences that I learned for the 18 years that I worked on that, it was just experiences that I couldn't replace, and experiences that really broadened my view on planning, as well as serving as a trustee and being in some challenging situations. And Evercore has not only we have a trust company, so we are allowed to serve as trustee, and at times it's well worth it to have someone outside of the family in that role that can be a buffer and not put family members in an awkward situation. Let me start now with more of our presentation on the wealth advisory business. And I thought I would just give you a short commercial in that Evercore Wealth Management is a national firm. We have offices in Minneapolis, San Francisco, New York, LA, and Tampa. We have $6.2 billion in assets, and long tenured partners. And one of the differentiators is that we are partners and owners in our business. And I think you all appreciate that when you're an owner, you're more dedicated in many ways. So now to focus in on what we should plan, in planning what we would do for you. Really my focus is, my focus is on the financial side and thinking about estate taxes, regular taxes, thinking about planning as far as gifting, things like that to minimize the tax, but also more important typically is just what is the right thing for your family. And one thing I can do as an outsider often is once I know a family, I can come to you and say, I think this might make sense for you to think about as an option. And how I begin with a family is, I really think it's like your model that you all use probably in your practices is probably very similar to what I do. Because you guys have a new patient and you have to ask the owner a lot of questions to figure out what your response is going to be. And it's very similar to what I do, and that you'll come back and say, this is the solution I offer. We have some different treatment programs that you can use. What are you comfortable with? And so you kind of have this good communication with your clients. And it's the same thing that I do, and that I try to step in their shoes and think through what I might want to offer as suggestions for them to consider. But I need to go back and touch point with them and say, these are ideas, what sounds of interest, what should we pursue further, what are you not interested in? For example, maybe I say from a tax standpoint that do they want to consider gifting to their children? And some people will just be totally uninterested in that. I just got this money. I don't really want to give it away to my kids. I want to have this money. And so it's me filling out, but at least you know that somebody will come and ask you the right questions, because we've been through this many times with other clients. The other comment I would make is typically I'm sitting probably at your dining room table, one-on-one with you and your spouse, or with Mike there on the investment side. But it's very conversational and more engaging than it feels like when I'm up here, because I don't do this very often. The other thing we would do to get started is to try to determine, based upon what you're getting and your proceeds from the sale, how much would that support? And how much of that should you plan to take out in a year? Things like that. So we would look at, this first slide is about kind of more straight line. There's not a lot of extra modeling in the background. But basically we think it's a reasonable assumption to assume a 7% return rate if you have a portfolio that has stocks and bonds. It's like 55% growth stocks and 45% more safe assets. And we have to take off inflation of 2.2%. And if we assume that you spend 3%, you'll still have 1.8% left for growth.
So is 7% considered actually a reasonable expectation in today's world?
I would say that you're never going to get 7%. It seems like it's going to be up 20, it's going to be down 10. It's going to be up 5, it's going to be up 12. 7%. The projection here is more for a balanced portfolio, and it's assuming 8 to 9% equity returns over a 10-year period, and then a compilation of other returns with other asset classes that's actually listed in really small print down below.
Okay.
It's your output is as good as the assumptions in your model. So I guess it's more for illustrative purposes. Maybe, bonds are not gonna give you
Right.
4 or 5% in the next 10 years. Maybe it's more 6 or 6.5, but that's something that we can do, adjust models. It's a moving target, depending on the valuation you get in.
And this one is a straight line, just basic math,
Right.
projection in this fact pattern. And, we can work with the person if they say, oh, well, that's not enough. Can you go run it the other way and see how much lower it becomes? If you turn to the next slide, or page in your book, I should say, in this fact pattern, we said if we spend $300,000, this is the graphic that shows that over time, if you do only spend that amount and you had 10 million, it would grow easily over time and stay ahead of inflation. The assumption is 10 million portfolio with 7% return, like we talked about. The other thing that's important to note, though, is we have to look at each of you and your own fact pattern of how old are you, how long will you be needing this money for retirement, are you planning to start another business, so you need to take some capital off the table, set it aside for that venture. So there's more personalization that would happen before we would run any projections, of asking a lot of questions to figure out what's the appropriate scenarios that you would want to find helpful. Then the next one would show you that if your spending requirement was 600,000, that it probably depends in this fact pattern of how old are you and are you going to out-survive your money, because over time that one will erode that level of spending would erode the capital to where in over 25 years that could become a problem. The impact of the variables is what matters a lot, though. So making the reasonable assumptions on the growth rates is important. The timeline, like I said, depending upon different ages, that the time horizon makes a huge difference in the outcome. As you can see here, someone that is closer to a retirement age may even want to be really conservative, and they pick the 3.2% return, have $10 million, and they can last out 35 years and still have $4 million because they picked the safer thing for their time horizon, which allowed them to do that. But if you have a longer time horizon, let's say you're trying to go to the 35 years, or if you try to go longer, it might not be as fruitful. Although it's obviously the 7%. The other thing about the timeline is if, in the first year of investing, the market goes down significantly, then your starting point dropped, and then you have to make that back up. So knowing that you have a certain time period that you need to for sure cover, that's where we work on coming up with the right asset allocation to begin with, and how much you would want to have in some safe assets. And we would typically think that it's good to have, we advise people a lot of times to have 2 to 3 years of what you want to spend in the safe assets. And the benefit of that is whenever you have a downturn in the market, you don't feel like you have to make a change. I think where most people really mess up is the market's down, it just nags at them that, oh no, oh no, oh no. And so they'll sell at the wrong time at the bottom of the market instead of hanging on. We just went through a big down and it's come back. But some people won't wait for the comeback before they act.
Julie?
Yes.
So, I get talking to different financial planners over the years, and let's say, X amount of money that might not make it to, we all think we're gonna get to be 100 or 90 or whatever, and God willing we will, but, when we have enough money, if like in our family, we don't spend a lot of money, we don't, pretty frugal, and the chunk of money that's coming in now, there's just, it's way more, so do we have to be conservative? I mean, cause I don't think if we live to be 100, we would never spend that money, so if we're not gonna be spending it, why not go for the most aggressive portfolio out there over time?
I think that you could be more aggressive, but I still would advise you to have some in something conservative.
So
Just
that-
from living through, having people be really aggressive that panic later.
So one of the things that my current advisor is recommending is, look, take this chunk of money, he figured out what we spend and what we're likely to spend. Take this chunk of money, put it in one of those indexed annuities with a guaranteed income for the rest of your life. And so you'll know you'll always get $100,000 or $150,000 a year for this money until you die. And then the rest of it, do what you want with. What do you think about that?
I think that annuities are appropriate for someone that doesn't have a lot of money. I think that if you have a lot of money, you don't need to pay those extra fees and cost of an annuity. You just need to invest in a prudent way, and you can do it yourself to make sure you have that money.
That gets back to my first point, just throwing a highly aggressive fund, let it go. Some years you'll be down $1 million, some years you'll be $2 million. Or, if in my family I've got a little dichotomy. My wife and I are slightly off on our investment strategies. Like, she wants to put it in a coffee can and bury it in the backyard. I want to put it on black tonight. We're slightly off, so, they're thinking like for my wife, let's get that guarantee so you don't have to worry, you're not gonna run out of money, even if Blair blows it all on black. And so you'll have that at least, and so, I don't know, that's what, partly because we've got an odd relationship. Anybody else have that with themselves?
No, of course
Just-
not. That's only your problem.
But I would say that it speaks a lot to your risk tolerance. You're aggressive, you know exactly what you need and you're provided for. So you can afford to be more aggressive. I have a client who's 82 years old and has never owned a bond in his life and will never own a bond in his life. The equity market has served him really well over time, and he's been aggressive the whole way through. I also have clients who are in their mid-50s that only want to invest in Minnesota municipal bonds. They just do not like the fluctuation. In fact, we kind of found out that lottery winners who haven't had exposure to the stock market, you should invest them pretty much all in treasuries or municipal bonds just because they see the fluctuation and they want to jump out the window. So it's very dependent on your personal situation. That could be a good solution in terms of the annuity and then being aggressive. The one thing you have to watch out for is fees for the annuity. And part of the Department of Labor ruling is going to hopefully X out some of those fees. Some annuities will just go away just because it's a difference between the fiduciary standard and the suitability standard. But I think that it's common for people. It's a dichotomy between the two.
Yeah, that's the
male and
problem
female.
is, I'm, aggressive is fine, but my wife is like, I'm not kidding you, she's got a bunch of money in CDs earning 0.6% and she's quite happy with that return.
So and I'll point out in my section of the presentation too that it's not volatility risk in the long term that you really have to worry about. It's inflation risk. And
definitely understand
we
that.
typically are contrarians in that when nobody expects inflation or interest rates to rise, because how many years do people expect interest rates to rise and they never hit it, right? And when nobody expects interest rates to rise, typically that's when interest rates rise and inflation happens. And you're already seeing it with wage growth. Minimum wages are up, everything else. But inflation is going to erode the value of your portfolio every day. It never never sleeps, and it's one thing in the long term you have to be careful about. So there's certain considerations there as well.
The other thing that we do quite often is when we start a relationship is we decide what accounts there's gonna be. And this goes along with the planning as far as, do you have a revocable trust in each of your names? So we'll put money in each pocket. So then your wife could have her own bucket and you could put any bonds that you do like to have in her pocket so that she feels more comfortable and you can be more aggressive in your portfolio. We've had success with that before in our past.
She can support you for the rest of
And then page 7, this is an example of something I actually used with some business owners, a presentation I gave to a group of business owners in Minnesota particularly. So I didn't update the scenarios per se, but what you guys already know what your price tag turned out, or is close to turning out to be. But in this fact pattern, we were talking to some people that were wanting to sell, but they really didn't know how much they needed to sell for to end up supporting what they would want in liquid assets. And so we backed into showing them, if you look at the bottom of the chart, it says 300, 400, or 500. And so they said, well, this is what my budget is. I need to have the 400. So based upon that, living in Minnesota, how much do I need to earn in a sales price? And it was $12 million. And then the gray bars show you what it would be after you pay the tax for the sale. And the light blue bar is after you've lived 30 years. So it gave them some comfort of knowing what they could possibly sell their business for and feel comfortable for the rest of their life. The other thing I challenge my clients to think about is how much is enough for the husband and wife, and if we can come up with what that number is and they're comfortable, then we spend more time talking about strategies that would reduce potential estate tax. And, or if you have, it's kind of basically like, okay, I had the big payday that's coming, I want to get a new this, and a new house, in another climate.